They left her a ruin instead of an inheritance. Her relatives laughed, thinking it was the end. But what she found inside the old house changed everything. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The house was too quiet after the last guests left. It was the kind of silence that pressed against the ears, heavy and deliberate, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Eleanor stood in the narrow hallway outside her parents' bedroom, her hand resting on the doorframe she had leaned against so many times as a child. The smell of lilies from the funeral still clung to the air, mingling with furniture polish and the faint trace of her mother's perfume, a scent that had always meant safety. Now it felt like a reminder of something permanently withdrawn. Her parents had been gone for only 3 days, yet the rhythm of the house had already changed. Voices no longer softened when they passed the living room. Footsteps no longer slowed near the staircase. Her brothers and sisters moved through the space with a new kind of ownership, opening drawers, checking documents, speaking in low, practical tones that made Eleanor feel like an intruder in a place she had never left. She was 30 years old, and for the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to be unprotected. The funeral itself had been flawless. Expensive flowers lined the chapel. The priest spoke of generosity, legacy, and family unity. Her siblings cried at the appropriate moments, dabbed their eyes, accepted condolences with solemn nods. Eleanor had cried too, but hers had been the quiet kind, the kind that never drew attention. She had stood slightly apart from the others, as she always had, listening to words about togetherness that felt strangely hollow. At the reception afterward, conversations shifted almost imperceptibly. The grief softened into logistics. People spoke about travel arrangements, legal matters, and timelines. Eleanor noticed how quickly the future was being discussed, as if her parents' absence had already been filed away as a completed chapter. That evening, her eldest brother, Marcus, announced that they would meet with the notary the next morning. He said it kindly enough, with the calm authority he had always assumed as the oldest, but there was something final in his tone. Eleanor nodded without speaking. She had never been good at fighting for space in conversations like these. The notary's office was small and formal, with dark wood shelves and a faint smell of old paper. Eleanor sat at the far end of the table, hands folded tightly in her lap. Her siblings filled the remaining chairs, their posture confident, expectant. No one looked at her for long. The document was read aloud in a steady, neutral voice. The family home, the one with the manicured garden and tall windows that caught the afternoon sun, would remain jointly owned by the siblings. Eleanor listened as the words settled around her like a verdict already understood. She did not expect anything different. She had never been part of their plans, never someone they imagined sharing walls with in the long term. Then the notary cleared his throat and mentioned the second property. It was described briefly, almost dismissively. An old house, located on the outskirts of town, surrounded by forest in poor condition. A structure that had belonged to the family generations ago, but had long since fallen out of use. That property, according to her parents' will, was to be left entirely to Eleanor. There was a pause, the kind that invites reaction. Marcus was the first to smile. It was not unkind, but it carried a trace of relief. Her sister Clara let out a small laugh, quickly covering it with a hand, as if she had been caught doing something inappropriate. Another brother murmured something about fairness, about how it suited Eleanor's quiet nature. Someone said it was nice that she would have her own place. Eleanor said nothing. She felt as if the room had tilted slightly, as if she were suddenly looking at everything from a different angle. She did not know that house. She barely remembered it, only vague childhood impressions of trees and shadows, and a sense that it was somewhere she was not meant to play. When they returned to the family home, the atmosphere shifted again. The unspoken understanding solidified into action. Marcus suggested it would be best if Eleanor moved out sooner rather than later. It would make things simpler, he said, easier for everyone to grieve properly. Clara added that the house would feel too crowded otherwise. Another sibling mentioned that Eleanor might prefer her independence. No one asked what she wanted. She packed her things in silence that night. Not much, just clothes, books, a few personal items that had survived the slow erosion of her presence in the household. As she moved from room to room, she realized how little of herself remained in the space. The walls carried her parents' history, her siblings' ambitions, but very little of her own. In the morning, Marcus drove her to the edge of the forest. The road narrowed as they left the main street, the pavement giving way to uneven gravel. Trees rose on either side, their branches bare and tangled, blocking out the sky. Eleanor watched the scenery change through the window, feeling as though she were being carried backward in time. When the car stopped, she thought at first that there must have been some mistake. The house stood slightly crooked among the trees, its roof sagging under the weight of moss and neglect. One side leaned more than the other, as if the structure were tired of standing upright. A wooden ladder rested against the front, its rungs warped and uneven. The windows were dark, some partially boarded, others clouded with grime. Ivy crept along the walls, claiming what time had weakened. Marcus got out of the car and opened the trunk. He handed Eleanor her suitcase, avoiding her eyes. "Well," he said, forcing a lightness into his voice, "this is it. Needs some work, but you've always liked quiet places." Eleanor nodded. She stepped closer to the house, her boots sinking slightly into damp leaves. The air smelled of earth and decay, sharp and cold in her lungs. For a moment, she could not bring herself to reach for the door. Marcus lingered behind her, then cleared his throat. "You'll manage," he said. "You always do." With that, he got back into the car and drove away, the sound of the engine fading quickly into the forest. Eleanor stood alone, the silence closing in around her more completely than it ever had in the family home. She opened the door with effort. It creaked loudly, protesting the disturbance. Inside, the space was dim and cold. Dust hung in the air, visible in thin beams of light that slipped through gaps in the roof. The floorboards groaned under her weight. There was no warmth, no sense of welcome, only the raw presence of abandonment. She set her suitcase down and leaned against the wall, closing her eyes. For the first time since her parents' deaths, the weight of everything pressed fully into her chest. The loss, the rejection, the quiet cruelty of being laughed away with a gesture and a signature. They thought this house was a punishment, a joke, a place she would endure briefly before giving up. Eleanor did not yet know why her parents had chosen this for her, or what they had hidden within these decaying walls. All she knew was that she had been exiled from the only life she had known, cast into the margins of her own family's story. As night began to fall and the forest darkened around the house, Eleanor lit a small lamp and sat on the floor, wrapped in her coat. The wind moved through the trees, brushing against the broken roof, whispering through the cracks. She listened, alone, at the beginning of a life she had never planned, standing at the threshold of a place that would demand everything she had and more. Morning came slowly, reluctantly, as if even the sun hesitated to approach the old house. Eleanor woke on the cold wooden floor, her coat folded beneath her head, her body stiff and aching. For a few disoriented seconds, she did not remember where she was. Then the smell returned to her senses first. Damp wood, earth, something faintly sour that spoke of long years without human presence. She opened her eyes and saw the low ceiling above her, darkened by age and stains, and the truth settled in again, heavy and unavoidable. This was hers now, or at least, this was where she had been sent. She sat up slowly, listening. The The forest was alive with early sounds, distant birds, the rustle of leaves stirred by wind, the quiet crack of branches somewhere far off. Inside the house, there was only stillness, broken now and then by a soft creak as the structure adjusted to the changing temperature. It felt less like a home and more like a body that had never healed properly. Eleanor stood and stretched, her breath forming faint clouds in the chilly air. She walked toward the window, careful with each step, as if the floor might give way beneath her. The glass was so clouded, she had to wipe it with her sleeve to see outside. Trees pressed close on all sides, their trunks tall and indifferent, their branches interwoven overhead. The house did not dominate the land. It was swallowed by it. She stepped outside, pulling her coat tighter around herself. The ground was uneven, covered in wet leaves and patches of moss. Up close, the house looked even worse than it had the day before. Parts of the roof had collapsed inward, leaving gaps through which daylight spilled like an accusation. The walls bore deep cracks, the wood warped and gray, as if the house had aged far beyond its years. A ladder leaned against the front, its presence oddly deliberate, as though someone had once planned to fix the roof and never returned. Eleanor touched one of the rungs. It crumbled slightly beneath her fingers. She felt a sharp surge of anger then, sudden and hot. Not at the house, but at the laughter she could still hear in her mind, the polite amusement in her siblings' voices, the way the notary had said "old house," as if it were a minor footnote, not a sentence. They had known exactly what they were doing. They had expected this moment to break her. The thought made her straighten her shoulders, even as fear pressed against her resolve. She went back inside and began to explore. The interior consisted of a few small rooms, poorly defined, as if the house had been altered many times without a clear plan. There was a main space that might once have been a living area, a narrow adjoining room that could have served as a bedroom, and a back section that held the remains of what looked like a kitchen. There was no electricity, no running water, no sign of recent habitation. Dust coated every surface. Cobwebs stretched between corners like thin, fragile bridges. She opened cabinets that hung crooked on their hinges. Most were empty, but one contained a single chipped mug and a rusted pot. She lifted them carefully, as if they were artifacts from another life. Someone had lived here once, not recently, but with intention. As she moved through the rooms, she became aware of something else. The house was not merely neglected, it resisted her. Doors stuck when she tried to open them. Floorboards groaned sharply beneath her weight, as if warning her to step back. Cold drafts slipped through cracks no matter how tightly she closed the shutters. It was as though the house itself questioned her presence, uncertain whether she belonged. By midday, exhaustion set in. Eleanor sat on the floor near the doorway, her back against the wall, staring out at the forest. Hunger gnawed at her, but she had little appetite. The silence pressed on her thoughts, giving them too much room to wander. She thought of the family home again, of warm kitchens and thick carpets, of a life where difficulty had always been softened by comfort. That world felt unreal now, like something she had imagined rather than lived. Here, nothing softened itself for her sake. A wave of doubt washed over her. She could leave. She could go to a hotel, to a friend, anywhere else. She did not have much money, but she had enough for a short escape. No one was forcing her to stay here. The house did not want her, and she was not sure she wanted it either. As if in response to the thought, a sudden gust of wind rattled the loose boards above her head. Dust fell from the ceiling, making her cough. Eleanor flinched, her heart pounding. She stood abruptly and stepped outside again, breathing deeply until the panic eased. The forest loomed around her, vast and unbothered. It did not care whether she stayed or left. The house did not care either. And somehow, That indifference steadied her more than kindness ever had. Her parents had chosen this place for her, not her siblings, not chance. Her parents. That thought lingered as she returned inside and began to clean, if only to keep her hands busy. She swept dust into small piles, wiped surfaces with an old cloth she found in her suitcase, opened windows to let in air despite the cold. Each small action felt insignificant against the scale of decay, but it was something she could control. As the afternoon wore on, Eleanor discovered small details that unsettled her assumptions. Beneath the grime, the woodwork showed careful craftsmanship. Certain joints were reinforced in ways that suggested forethought, not haste. The shelves, though warped, had been fitted precisely to the walls. Even the placement of windows seemed deliberate, angled to catch light at specific times of day. This had not been a temporary shelter. Someone had planned to live here. The realization deepened her unease. Why had her parents kept this place hidden from her? Why leave her something so demanding, so hostile at first glance? As evening approached, the temperature dropped sharply. Eleanor layered her clothes and lit the small, portable lantern she had brought with her. Shadows danced along the walls, distorting their shape. She ate a simple meal from her bag and sat quietly, listening to the sounds of the forest grow louder as night settled in. Fear returned with the darkness, creeping into her thoughts. Every creak sounded like a footstep. Every gust of wind felt like a warning. She lay down near the door, her back pressed against the wall, her lantern dimmed to conserve power. Sleep came fitfully, broken by dreams of falling through rotten floors and calling out to voices that never answered. When she woke again, it was still dark. Rain drummed softly against the roof, slipping through the gaps and landing on the floor in cold drops. Eleanor watched the water pool near the far wall, her chest tightening. The house was not just uncomfortable, it was unsafe. She sat up, her mind racing. This place could kill her, slowly, through cold, illness, or collapse. The thought terrified her more than her siblings' cruelty ever had. And yet, beneath the fear, something else stirred. A quiet, stubborn resolve she barely recognized as her own. If this house was meant to defeat her, then leaving now would mean accepting the role they had written for her. The quiet one. The weak one. The sister who took what she was given and disappeared. Eleanor rose to her feet as the rain continued to fall, her body aching, her heart heavy, but her gaze steady. She did not know how long she could endure this place. She did not yet understand why her parents had chosen it. All she knew was that running would answer none of the questions pressing against her mind. She moved the dripping bucket beneath the worst leak, wiped water from the floor, and sat down again, wrapped tightly in her coat. The house did not welcome her. It tested her, chilled her, unsettled her. But as dawn began to lighten the edges of the forest once more, Eleanor realized something quietly profound. She was still here. And for now, that was enough to take her one step deeper into the life that awaited her, hidden beneath decay, waiting to be uncovered. The rain stopped just before dawn, leaving the forest soaked and silent, as if it were holding on to a secret it was not yet ready to reveal. Eleanor woke with a dull ache in her back and a heaviness in her chest that had nothing to do with the cold. For a long moment, she lay still, listening to the drip of water from the roof into the bucket she had placed beneath the leak. Each drop echoed in the empty space, marking time with quiet insistence. She rose slowly and wrapped herself in her coat. The house looked no better in the gray morning light. If anything, the damage was more visible now. The cracks in the walls seemed deeper, the stains on the ceiling darker, as though the house were exposing itself without shame. Eleanor stood in the center of the main room and turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. She could not stay like this. Not indefinitely. But she also could not leave without understanding why this place had been given to her. That question followed her as she began another day of tentative exploration. She moved with more purpose now, less like a guest, and more like someone trying to read the language of an unfamiliar but important text. Her parents had never been careless. If they had left her this house, there was a reason. She needed to find it. Near the back wall of what might once have been a bedroom, she noticed an old dresser pushed awkwardly into a corner. One of its drawers was warped, refusing to close completely. She knelt and tugged at it. The wood protested with a sharp groan, then gave way. Inside, beneath a layer of dust, lay a small stack of papers bound with twine that had long since frayed. Eleanor's breath caught. The papers were yellowed, brittle at the edges. Letters. She recognized her mother's handwriting immediately, neat and careful, slanting slightly to the right. Her father's was bolder, more uneven. The letters pressed hard into the page, as if each word had required effort. She carried the bundle to the window and sat on the floor, the light falling across the pages like a quiet invitation. Her hands trembled as she untied the string. The first letter was addressed simply, without formality, as though the writer had never imagined it would be read by anyone else. It spoke of the house, of the land, of the decision they had made together, not as an afterthought, but as a plan. They wrote about her, about Eleanor, about her quiet strength, the way she observed the world instead of trying to dominate it, about how she would need something that challenged her, something that couldn't be taken from her by louder voices. Eleanor felt a pressure behind her eyes as she read. This was not an act of neglect. It was an act of faith. As she turned the pages, the tone shifted. The letters spoke of difficulties the house carried with it, repairs that had never been finished, legal matters left unresolved, responsibilities that demanded patience and resilience rather than money. Her parents had known this place would not offer her comfort. It would offer her a trial. She let the papers fall into her lap, staring at the floor. A bitter laugh escaped her before she could stop it. Her siblings had believed this house was a punishment. They had been wrong. It was worse than that. It was a test. Later that day, Eleanor ventured further into the house, her search now guided by the knowledge that there was more hidden here than decay. Behind a loose board near the kitchen wall, she found an old metal box. Inside were documents she barely understood at first glance, old property records, notes about debts tied to the land, evidence of obligations that had never been formally resolved. Her stomach tightened as the implications became clear. The house was not only falling apart physically, it was burdened by the past in ways that could easily crush someone unprepared. This was why her siblings had been spared. They would never have accepted such a burden. They would have sold the land, walked away, erased the problem. Her parents had not wanted that. Eleanor sat back on her heels, exhaustion washing over her. She felt anger then, sharp and unexpected. Anger at her parents for leaving her something so heavy. Anger at herself for feeling ungrateful. Anger at a family that had reduced inheritance to comfort instead of meaning. The house seemed to watch her as she sat there, silent and demanding. For the first time, she spoke aloud. "You didn't make this easy," she said quietly, her voice echoing faintly off the walls. The words hung in the air, unanswered, but saying them eased something inside her. She was allowed to resent this, allowed to struggle with it. The test was not one of blind acceptance, but of endurance. As the day passed, Eleanor discovered more signs of intention woven into the house's structure. Reinforced beams hidden beneath rot. Carefully planned drainage channels long clogged with debris. Even the position of the house itself, angled slightly to shield it from the harshest winds, spoke of foresight. Someone had loved this place enough to think ahead, even if time had undone much of their work. With each discovery, her understanding shifted. The house was not rejecting her. It was indifferent. It demanded competence, attention, commitment. It demanded that she show up fully or not at all. That evening, Eleanor sat at the small table she had dragged into the main room. The letters spread before her. She reread them slowly, absorbing not just the words, but the trust behind them. Her parents had known exactly how difficult this would be. They had also known she would not be destroyed by it. She slept more deeply that night, exhaustion finally claiming her. When she woke the next morning, the house felt no warmer, no kinder. But it felt different. Less like an enemy, more like an unresolved argument. Eleanor began to understand that this inheritance was not about property or value. It was about choice, about whether she would accept responsibility where others had refused it, about whether she would define herself by what was easy or by what was necessary. Standing in the doorway as the forest stirred awake once more, Eleanor felt the weight of that choice settle fully onto her shoulders. She did not yet know how she would repair the house, or untangle its debts, or survive the coming months. But she knew this much. If she walked away now, she would carry this unfinished question with her forever. She stepped back inside, closing the door behind her, and began to plan. The decision to stay did not make the work easier. If anything, it made the weight of it more real. Once Eleanor accepted that she would not leave, the house seemed to demand proof. Every weakness revealed itself at once, as if the structure sensed hesitation and sought to exploit it. She began with the roof, because it frightened her the most. Each night, she lay awake, listening for the sound of splitting wood, imagining collapse. The ladder outside became both a tool and a threat. Its rungs bent under her weight, forcing her to move slowly, deliberately, testing each step before trusting it. From above, the damage looked worse than she had imagined. Rot had eaten through entire sections, leaving gaps large enough to see the floor below. Moss clung thickly to the shingles, holding moisture like a sponge. Her hands blistered quickly. She tore them open on nails left exposed decades ago, on splintered boards that gave way without warning. More than once, she froze halfway up the ladder, her heart pounding, the forest spinning around her, convinced she had made a terrible mistake. Each time, she forced herself to keep going, driven not by confidence, but by stubborn refusal to retreat. The days blurred together. She worked until her muscles trembled, stopped only when pain became sharp enough to demand attention. At night, she collapsed onto the floor, too exhausted to dream. Hunger came and went, overshadowed by the constant ache in her body. Failure became familiar. A board she replaced would slip loose the next morning. A section she thought secure would leak again at the first rain. Each setback felt personal, as if the house were reminding her of her inexperience, her isolation. There were moments when she cried openly, slumped against the wall with dirt streaking her face, tears cutting clean paths through the grime. No one saw her. No one offered encouragement. The forest bore silent witness, indifferent and vast. It was during one of those moments that she heard footsteps. At first, she thought she was imagining it. Her exhaustion had begun to play tricks on her senses, but the sound persisted, steady and unmistakable, approaching from the direction of the narrow path that led toward the road. Eleanor wiped her face quickly and stood, her heart racing. She stepped outside, her pulse loud in her ears. A man emerged from between the trees, carrying a bundle of wooden planks on his shoulder. He stopped when he saw her, surprise flickering across his face. They stood there for a moment, measuring each other in silence. He was around her age, perhaps a few years older, with the look of someone accustomed to physical labor. His clothes were worn but clean, his hands rough, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested competence rather than arrogance. "I didn't know anyone was living here," he said finally. Eleanor's instinctive response was defensive. "I am," she replied. "Now." He nodded, accepting the answer without comment. "I'm Daniel. I work on properties around here, clearing land, repairs. I was told this place was abandoned." "It was," she said. "It isn't anymore." Another pause followed. He glanced up at the roof, then at the ladder, then back at her. His expression did not soften with pity, nor did it sharpen with judgment. It remained neutral, observant. "That section won't hold much longer," he said calmly. "Not unless you reinforce it from the inside." Eleanor felt irritation flare. "I know," she said, more sharply than she intended. Daniel raised his hand slightly, not offended. "Just saying. I didn't come to interfere." She studied him, unsure what to make of his presence. Strangers had not figured into her calculations. She had assumed isolation was absolute. "What do you want?" she asked. He hesitated, then shifted the planks on his shoulder. "I was going to offer these to whoever owned the place. They were left over from another job. Seemed a shame to waste them." Eleanor looked at the wood, then back at him. Pride rose quickly, instinctive and rigid. She had accepted enough unwanted generosity from her family. She was not eager to begin again. "I don't need charity," she said. Daniel considered her for a moment, then nodded. "All right." He turned slightly, preparing to leave. Something in his easy acceptance unsettled her more than insistence would have. He did not argue, did not press. He treated her refusal as final, as valid. "Wait," she said, surprising herself. He turned back. "How much do you want for them?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "Nothing. But if it makes you feel better, you can help me unload them." They carried the planks together, stacking them near the wall. Daniel worked efficiently, without commentary, without questions. Eleanor found herself matching his pace, grateful for the temporary silence. When they finished, he stepped back, dusting off his hands. "If you need advice," he said, "I live not far from here. You can ask. Or not. Up to you." With that, he left, disappearing into the trees as quietly as he had arrived. Eleanor stood where he had been, unsettled by the encounter. She had expected intrusion, perhaps condescension. Instead, she had been offered something simpler. Help without strings. Over the following days, Daniel returned intermittently. Sometimes he brought materials. Sometimes he simply checked on her progress. He never stayed long, never overstayed his welcome. When Eleanor asked questions, he answered them plainly, without lecturing. When she struggled, he showed her how to adjust her grip, her stance, her approach. They worked side by side, often in silence. Words came slowly, naturally, without urgency. He spoke of his own life in fragments, revealing just enough to make him human without inviting sympathy. He had lost people, too. Not recently, but deeply enough that the absence still shaped his days. Eleanor found herself talking more than she intended, about the house, about her parents, about the way her family had turned on her with careful smiles and clean hands. Daniel listened without interrupting, without offering solutions. "I don't need you to fix this," she said once, frustration edging her voice. "I just need to get through it." He nodded. That's usually how it is. As the house slowly changed, so did Eleanor. The work became less frantic, more deliberate. She learned to read the structure, to anticipate its weaknesses. Her hands toughened. Her movements grew surer. She still failed, still misjudged. But the failures no longer sent her spiraling into despair. The house responded in its own way. The leaks lessened. The draft softened. Light began to settle differently in the rooms, as boards were replaced and spaces reclaimed. Daniel never positioned himself as a savior. He left when his work was done, trusted her to continue alone. That trust mattered more than any repair he helped complete. One evening, as the sun sank behind the trees, they sat on the steps Eleanor had rebuilt that afternoon. The forest glowed briefly with fading light, then darkened. "You don't have to stay here forever," Daniel said quietly. Eleanor considered the statement. "I know. But you're staying now." "Yes." He nodded, satisfied. "That matters." For the first time since arriving at the house, Eleanor felt something loosen inside her. Not hope exactly. Something steadier. The sense that struggle did not have to be solitary, even if the path remained her own. As Daniel stood to leave, Eleanor realized she no longer associated the house solely with fear. It was still demanding, still harsh, but it was no longer empty, and neither was she. The house had begun to breathe differently. Eleanor noticed it in small, almost imperceptible ways. The way the floor no longer groaned in protest at every step, but answered with a dull, familiar creak. The way the patched sections of the roof held firm during rain, no longer allowing water to fall like accusations into the rooms below. The house was still old, still scarred, but it no longer felt hostile. It felt alert, as if it were watching her with a new kind of attention. With that change came something else. A sense that the work she had done so far was only a prelude. The letters from her parents remained on the small table in the main room, their pages smoothed by repeated readings. Eleanor had memorized many of the passages, but one sentence in particular refused to release its grip on her thoughts. It was written in her father's hand, heavier than the others, as though the words themselves had weighed on him. "You will know when the house is ready to tell you the rest." She had dismissed it at first as sentiment. Now, standing in the half-light of the room, she felt a faint unease settle in her chest. The house was changing. So was she. And with that change came the quiet certainty that something remained hidden, waiting not for strength, but for understanding. It was Daniel who unwittingly led her closer to it. They were working together near the back wall, clearing debris that had accumulated over decades. Eleanor had focused on structural repairs until now, but this section had remained untouched, partially blocked by collapsed shelving and old crates fused together by moisture and time. As they shifted a heavy beam aside, Daniel paused. "This wall doesn't match the rest," he said. Eleanor frowned and stepped closer. He was right. The boards here were newer, though still old by any reasonable measure. The nails were different too, set at irregular intervals. "Someone closed this off," Daniel continued, "a long time ago." Eleanor's heart began to race. She knelt and ran her fingers along the seams. There was a faint hollow sound when she pressed against one section, subtle but unmistakable. They worked in silence after that, dismantling the wall carefully, piece by piece. Dust filled the air, stinging Eleanor's eyes, but she did not stop. When the last board came loose, it revealed a shallow cavity, no deeper than a narrow closet, hidden entirely from view. Inside, stacked neatly and protected by oilcloth, were documents. Eleanor's breath caught as she reached for them. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the first paper, then the next. Deeds. Old ones. Survey maps marked with careful annotations. Legal records bearing dates that stretched back generations. Daniel watched her face change as she read. "This isn't just the house," she whispered. The land described in the documents extended far beyond the immediate clearing. Acres of forest, boundaries that cut directly through areas her siblings had always assumed belonged to the family estate attached to the larger house. Her parents had not merely left her a decaying structure. They had left her the foundation of something far greater. As the implications settled, Eleanor felt a strange mix of triumph and dread. This was why the house had been hidden, why it had been given to her quietly, almost dismissively. Her parents had known exactly what would happen if the truth had been revealed too soon. Daniel spoke carefully. "Do your siblings know about this?" Eleanor shook her head. "They think this place is worthless." "They won't, once they find out." The words lingered between them, heavy with inevitability. She was right. It did not take long for the past to resurface with sharp teeth. A week later, Eleanor received a call from her sister Clara. The tone was different from before, polite, strained, too careful. "We heard you're doing some renovations," Clara said. "Yes," Eleanor replied evenly. "And that you found some old paperwork." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. So they already knew something. "Who told you that?" she asked. "That's not important," Clara replied. "What matters is that those documents concern family property. We should discuss this together." Together. The word tasted bitter. The discussion, when it came, was nothing like Clara's tone had promised. Eleanor returned to the family home for the first time since her exile, stepping once more into the polished halls that now felt foreign to her. Her siblings were waiting in the living room, their expressions tense, their posture unified in a way that excluded her entirely. Marcus spoke first. "You should have told us what you found," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I didn't know I had to," Eleanor replied. "The house was left to me. So was everything in it." "That doesn't mean you own the land," another sibling cut in. "That land has always been part of the estate." Eleanor placed the documents on the table. "According to these, it hasn't. Not for a long time." The room fell silent as they examined the papers. Eleanor watched their faces shift from disbelief to calculation. "This changes things," Marcus said slowly. "It changes nothing," Eleanor replied, "except that now you know." Their reaction was swift and revealing. Arguments followed, layered with accusations disguised as concern. They spoke of fairness, of family unity, of how Eleanor had always misunderstood her place. They suggested legal reviews, shared ownership, compromises that would benefit everyone. Eleanor listened quietly, feeling a strange detachment settle over her. These were the same voices that had laughed when she was sent to the forest, the same hands that had pushed her out of the house without hesitation. "I'm not negotiating," she said finally. Marcus stared at her. "You don't understand what you're risking." "I understand perfectly," she replied. "You assumed I would fail. You assumed this place would break me. You were wrong." The room erupted then. Anger replaced pretense. Old resentment surfaced, sharpened by envy. Eleanor saw clearly now what she had always sensed, but never named. Her siblings had not resented her weakness. They had resented her difference, the quiet way she endured, the refusal to compete on their terms. She left without looking back. The pressure intensified in the days that followed. Letters arrived from lawyers. Phone calls came at all hours. Distant relatives reached out suddenly, offering advice they had never bothered to give before. The past was clawing its way into her present, determined to reclaim what it had dismissed. Through it all, the house remained steady. Daniel noticed the strain in her immediately. He did not ask questions at first. He simply stayed longer, worked harder, filled the silence with presence rather than solutions. When Eleanor finally told him everything, she expected concern, perhaps even doubt. Instead, he nodded. "They underestimated you," he said. "Yes," Eleanor replied, "and now they want to correct that mistake." Daniel looked toward the forest, then back at the house. This place didn't survive this long by accident. Neither did you. That night, Eleanor sat alone with the documents spread around her. She traced the lines on the maps, the names written in careful ink. She thought of her parents, of the choice they had made, knowing exactly how difficult this would become. The past had returned, not as memory, but as challenge. And Eleanor understood now that there would be no turning back. The house had given her its truth. What she did with it would define everything that followed. The house stood nearly whole now. It was not beautiful in the way new things are beautiful. Its lines were still uneven, its wood marked by time, its scars visible to anyone who cared to look closely. But it stood with a quiet confidence that had been absent when Eleanor first arrived. The roof no longer sagged. The walls no longer whispered threats in the wind. Light entered the rooms deliberately, settling where it was meant to settle, as if the house itself had learned to trust her presence. Eleanor noticed the change most clearly in herself. She woke each morning with purpose instead of dread. The ache in her muscles had become familiar, almost reassuring, a reminder of work accomplished rather than weakness endured. Her hands, once soft, now bore calluses that no longer surprised her when she caught sight of them. She moved through the house without hesitation, knowing where each board would creak, which step needed reinforcement, which window caught the afternoon sun. The house no longer tested her with cruelty. It tested her with responsibility. And with that responsibility came a new weight, one far heavier than rot and broken beams. The documents were now organized, studied, understood. With Daniel's help and the advice of a local attorney he trusted, Eleanor had begun the process of formally asserting her rights to the land. It was slow, exhausting work, filled with unfamiliar language and deliberate delays. Each step forward seemed to provoke a reaction from her siblings, who now circled like anxious sentinels, watching for any opening. They wrote letters that dripped with false warmth. They suggested meetings, dinners, reconciliations. They spoke of how much their parents would have wanted peace among their children. Eleanor read every message carefully. Then she set them aside. What unsettled her was not their persistence, but the realization that she no longer needed their approval. The anger that once flared at the thought of them had dulled, replaced by something quieter and more dangerous: indifference. It was Daniel who first voiced what Eleanor had been circling in her thoughts for weeks. They were standing at the edge of the property one evening, the forest stretching endlessly beyond the boundary markers Eleanor had recently uncovered. The air was cool, the light fading. "You could stay here," Daniel said, almost casually. "Build something permanent. This land could support it." Eleanor did not answer right away. She had imagined this future herself, a life rooted here. The house restored fully, expanded perhaps, the land shaped into something lasting. It would be a victory in every sense. Proof that she had not only survived exile, but transformed it. And yet, the idea did not settle in her chest the way she expected it to. "I know," she said finally, "but I'm not sure that's what this was meant to be." Daniel studied her face. "What do you mean?" Eleanor turned back toward the house. From a distance, it looked calm, almost watchful. "This place taught me how to stand on my own," she said slowly, "how to endure, how to choose myself when no one else would. But staying here forever would mean living inside the memory of that fight." Daniel said nothing, but she sensed his understanding. He had never mistaken her strength for stubbornness. He knew the difference between building something because it was right and clinging to something because it had cost too much to abandon. The pressure from her family intensified as her legal claims advanced. One afternoon, Marcus arrived unannounced, stepping out of his car with the same controlled confidence he had always worn like armor. He looked around at the restored structure, the cleared land, the evidence of Eleanor's labor. "I didn't think you'd get this far," he said. Eleanor did not rise to the implied insult. Neither did I. He hesitated, then sighed. You're forcing us into a corner. I didn't force anything, she replied. You assumed I would fail. Marcus's jaw tightened. We can still make this easy. There is no easy version of this, Eleanor said. Not anymore. He studied her, truly studied her, perhaps for the first time. Something shifted in his expression, not quite respect, but recognition. You've changed, he said. Yes, she answered. That was the point. When he left, Eleanor felt no triumph, only clarity. The house had done its work. The inheritance had revealed its final demand. Choice. That night, Eleanor sat alone at the small table where she had first read her parents' letters. She spread them out once more, reading not just the words, but the intent beneath them. Her parents had not wanted her to prove anything to her siblings. They had wanted her to prove something to herself. Daniel joined her later, sitting across from her in quiet companionship. I don't want to lose this, he said carefully, not looking at her. Us. Eleanor reached for his hand, her grip steady. You won't. But I can't build my future on a foundation made of defiance. He met her gaze then. What do you want? The answer came without hesitation. I want a life that isn't shaped by what was taken from me. I want to choose where I go next, not because I won something, but because I'm ready to move on. They spoke late into the night, not of escape, but of direction, of places unmarked by resentment, of building something together, not as survivors clinging to victory, but as partners choosing possibility. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor completed the legal process with calm determination. She secured her rights fully, not to punish her siblings, but to close the chapter cleanly. When the final documents were signed, she felt not relief, but a profound stillness. The house no longer asked anything of her. Standing on the porch at dawn, Eleanor traced the familiar lines of the structure one last time. She felt gratitude, not ownership. Respect, not attachment. The house had been a trial, not a destination, and she was ready to choose what came next. The morning Eleanor left the house, the forest was unusually quiet. There was no wind in the branches, no restless rustling of leaves, no distant cry of birds to mark the passage of time. The silence felt deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if the land itself had paused to watch her go. A pale light filtered through the trees, soft and even, settling on the roof she had rebuilt with her own hands, on the steps she had repaired board by board, on the walls that no longer leaned away from the world in quiet surrender. She stood at the edge of the clearing for a long time, her coat folded over her arm, her suitcase resting by her feet. Daniel waited a few steps behind her, giving her space without needing to be asked. He understood, as he had from the beginning, that this moment belonged to her alone. Eleanor let her gaze move slowly over every familiar detail. She remembered the first night she had slept on the floor, cold and terrified, listening to water drip through the broken roof. She remembered the mornings when her hands shook from exhaustion, when she wondered if stubbornness alone would be enough to keep her standing. She remembered the anger, the humiliation, the quiet despair that had followed her into the forest like a shadow. None of it felt heavy now. The house no longer represented exile or punishment. It no longer felt like proof of her family's cruelty or her parents' impossible expectations. It stood simply as what it was, a place where she had learned who she was when nothing was given freely. Eleanor stepped forward and placed her hand against the wooden wall. The surface was rough beneath her palm, solid and warm where the sun had touched it. She closed her eyes briefly, not in grief, but in acknowledgement. "Thank you," she whispered, unsure whether she was speaking to the house, the land, or the past itself. When she turned back, Daniel was watching her with quiet attentiveness. There was no urgency in his expression, no impatience, only readiness. They drove away together, the narrow path giving way slowly to the road, the forest receding behind them. Eleanor did not look back again. She did not need to. The place had already settled into her memory, not as an ache, but as a foundation. Their new home was nothing like the old one. It stood at the edge of a small town, modest but sturdy, with clean lines and windows that caught the light without resistance. It did not challenge her. It did not demand proof. It welcomed her with uncomplicated openness. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt what it meant to enter a space without bracing herself for harm. They moved in gradually, deliberately. There was no rush, no sense of escape. Each piece of furniture was chosen carefully. Each room took shape through shared decisions rather than solitary endurance. Daniel did not take over, nor did Eleanor retreat into silence. They built this life as they had rebuilt the house in the forest, through mutual effort, honest communication, and patience. The past did not disappear simply because Eleanor had chosen to move forward. Her siblings still existed, still watched from a distance, still measured her success against their own expectations, but their influence no longer reached her. When Marcus called, his tone cautious and strained, Eleanor listened, without resentment. "I didn't think it would end this way," he admitted once. "Neither did I," Eleanor replied. "But this way is better." She did not attend family gatherings. She did not seek reconciliation that demanded self-erasure. The chapter was closed, not with bitterness, but with finality. In quiet moments, Eleanor thought of her parents. She understood them now in ways she hadn't before. They had known the cost of what they were leaving her. They had also known her capacity to bear it. They had trusted her with a truth her siblings had never been asked to face. That inheritance is not always meant to comfort. Sometimes it is meant to shape. Daniel found her one evening sitting on the porch of their new home, watching the sky darken. "You're thinking about it again," he said gently. "Yes," she admitted. "But it doesn't hurt anymore." He sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Do you ever wish you'd stayed?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. "No," she said at last. "If I had stayed, it would have meant the house owned me. Leaving means I own the story." They built a future that did not rely on proving anything to anyone. Eleanor returned to work she loved, this time without fear of being displaced. Daniel expanded his projects, no longer bound to temporary repairs, but to long-term creation. Together, they made plans that felt expansive rather than reactive. The forest house remained in Eleanor's life, though no longer as a dwelling. She ensured it was cared for, preserved as a place of history rather than struggle. It became what it had always been meant to be, a marker of passage, not a destination. Years later, when Eleanor spoke of that time, she did so without drama. She did not frame herself as a victim or a victor. She spoke instead of learning how to endure without hardening, how to choose without resentment, how to leave without abandoning what mattered. Sometimes, on quiet mornings, she would remember the sound of rain on a broken roof, the weight of exhaustion in her bones, the silence of the forest watching her decide whether to stay or go. And she would feel a deep, steady gratitude. The old house had been offered to her as a joke, as a dismissal, as a place meant to swallow her quietly. Instead, it had given her exactly what she needed: a beginning. And with that beginning behind her, Eleanor lived fully in the life she had chosen, carrying forward not the pain of exile, but the strength it had revealed. If this story resonated with you, please support the channel by liking the video and subscribing. More stories like this are coming soon, and you won't want to miss them.